Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would prohibit the Securities and Exchange Commission from using funds under this act to pursue a political agenda on climate change and instead return its focus to their three-part mission: to protect investors, to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. My amendment relates to the SEC's 2010 interpretive guidance for companies to disclose the impact that global climate change may have on their business. My amendment is necessary and timely, given the SEC's recent regulation, SK concept release, that suggests the SEC is moving toward further action on this issue. It's even more important in light of a campaign by several states' attorneys generals to impede the First Amendment rights of those who dare question the accuracy of climate change science. More and more, we've seen the federal securities laws and disclosure system abused for political purposes, from the median pay ratio disclosure requirement of Dodd-Frank to the conflict minerals to climate change. These politically motivated and mandated disclosures are not about protecting investors. They're about shaming companies, or at least attempting to shame companies, into adopting their agenda. It's a waste of resources for the companies, for their shareholders, and for the SEC. Publicly traded companies are already required to disclose all material information. Having companies disclose information on immaterial issues, like climate, is highly speculative and dubious at very best. Regardless of how you feel about climate change policy, securities law is not the place for it. We already have agencies in place to help protect our environment. The SEC's job is to protect investors, and that means making sure they have material information to make sound investments. The SEC's guidance is also at odds with the FAST Act of 2015, legislation the President has signed, and that requires the SEC to simplify, not make more complex, the current disclosure regime by June 1st, a deadline which the SEC's already missed. Clearly, there are better, more pressing uses for the SEC's finite resources. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment and refocus the SEC on their core mission, and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. Any member wishing to seek time in opposition? For purpose, the gentleman from New York.
Yes.
You're recognized for 5 minutes in opposition.
I'm not trying to be funny here, but I'm trying to figure out what political climate issues are. Maybe it's Democrats manipulate the weather so it only hurts certain people. I don't know what it means. But I rise in opposition to the amendment. Indeed, this amendment would prevent the SEC from enforcing or codifying into law its 2010 interpretive guidance to public companies intended to provide great transparency to investors on the material risk and opportunities of those companies to climate change. This guidance was put forth after nearly 100 investors representing $7 trillion in wealth management specifically petitioned the SEC for this clarity. Additionally, the guidance doesn't create new climate change regulatory frameworks or mandates. Instead, it simply provides clarity on what companies should view as a material risk or opportunity that ought to be disclosed to investors. Given that Hurricane Sandy caused $70 billion in damage, it's difficult to say that climate change doesn't have an impact on business unless you deny the existence of climate change in the first place. Democrats support efforts by the SEC to modernize public company disclosures so that investors are appropriately apprised of their material risks, including their risks to climate change. H.R. 4792, for example, represents a bicameral effort by Democrats to encourage the SEC to do more, not less, to ensure investors are aware of climate change risks like the effect of carbon costs on oil and gas companies. This amendment always runs counter to a recent decision by the SEC to require ExxonMobil to allow a shareholder proposal from New York State Common Fund and the Church of England to come up for a vote on this issue. That proposal would require ExxonMobil to disclose to shareholders how climate change may impact their profits. Indeed, shareholders are increasingly craving this information. Since the beginning of 2016, 8 shareholder proposals have gone to a vote at oil and gas and utility companies requesting increased disclosure of their plans to mitigate the impact from climate change on their operations. Average support for the proposal was 31%, but at Occidental Petroleum, nearly a majority of shareholders voted in favor. In comparison, in 2015, climate change-related proposals received an average of 17.5% support, with the highest support, 36%, at Marathon Oil Corporation. If the SEC guidance on this was stronger, and if the SEC enforced this mandate, these shareholder proposals which go further than voluntary disclosures would not be necessary. As the impacts of climate change continue to be felt by individuals and businesses alike, shareholders will demand more information about the risks associated with their investments. The SEC should do more, not less, to clarify to companies the material risks they must disclose to their shareholders and owners. I urge opposition to this amendment.
Reserve?
I do.
Thank you. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize if I wasn't clear. This amendment does not stop companies from mentioning bona fide weather and environmental risk in their disclosures. If a company wants to weigh in on climate change, nothing in this amendment would prevent them from volunteering that information. But the reality is that companies are already required to disclose all material information. We shouldn't allow the disclosure system to continue to be used as a tool for special interest. Instead of forcing agendas on companies, the SEC should be focused on protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation. The SEC let Bernard Madoff run free for 10 years, a decade, while he evaporated $70 billion worth of people's life savings and hard-earned money. They were asleep at the switch. They were busy doing something else like this. Their job is to protect investors, and that's the intent of this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from New York.
You know, there was a time, I must tell you, I've been in public office 43 years, and only once in those years in the State Assembly, New York, and in Congress, did an agency come before me and say, we don't want any more money, we have enough. That was the SEC in the old days, under another administration. They didn't want any more money, and I was shocked. No agency ever does that. Then when Wall Street fell apart, we found out why. They didn't want any more money because they didn't want to enforce anything. So you're right that Madoff got away with a lot of stuff. But now, when we have an SEC that looks at things differently, that says that we should ask questions, that we should, for instance, tell people, tell your shareholders what you're doing to mitigate the problems that they may face as shareholders, now we want to stop them. We can't have it both ways. I agree with you. Madoff and people like him got away with things, but not because this SEC in these modern times was looking the other way. It was because it was during a period of time when they didn't care, they didn't enforce anything. And a lot of people didn't enforce anything. I'll give you an example, which is related. To my understanding, not a single person from Wall Street went to prison. I don't know if that's possible anywhere else.
Time has expired.
May I ask how much time I have left?
The gentleman from Florida has 1 minute And the gentleman from New York's time has expired.
Well, the new SEC, the old SEC, I've been here a little bit less than 8 years, but I heard the new SEC secretary say, well, there's really nothing to worry about. Half of the 38 employees who are culpable in allowing Madoff to run free are no longer with the agency. She couldn't tell us what happened to them if they're with another federal agency, if they're retired on the public dime. But that's just like saying a pedophile changed neighborhoods, problem solved. The fact is, we need to have SEC focused on protecting investors. That's their main course. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what the public expects them to do. And that's what this amendment will allow them to do. Thank you. I yield back.